Hi again then guys, and welcome to, of course, another review in the world of GT Sport in particular, and this time we're talking about a vehicle which is kind of notorious, especially if you've watched Top Gear a few years ago when Clarkson spoke about the vehicle, and the car certainly didn't tickle his fancy. He didn't like the vehicle very much at all. He said that it was far too heavy. If I recall, he didn't like the handling all that much, and just found it to be a rather underwhelming attempt at something like a BMW M3 rival. And that is what I think the problem is. I think that Clarkson's problem is the same problem that many people could have about this car, and that is the RCF is not and never would be a true BMW M3 rival. But I would argue it was never supposed to be. Because if you consider everything about the car, it shares very little in common with an M3. However, there is something else that it shares a lot in common with. Consider the 5-litre V8 engine. Torquey, lazy, low down power. It's very heavy, it's very luxurious, it's very tech forward with the 8-speed gearbox, the well-equipped interior, the 2+2 coupe layout with a lot of space, the muscular bodywork with the unusually large exhausts. Now, what I just described could very easily be not a Lexus RCF, but could actually be a Mercedes AMG. And that is what I would argue the best rival to the RCF actually is. Something like a Mercedes C63 Coupe or a CLK Coupe. That, to me, is why many people underestimate this car and falsely say that it's not as good as an M3, because I would argue it's not supposed to be like an M3. So of course it's not necessarily as good as one, because even if you compared something like a Mercedes C63 to a BMW M3, that car would fall short as well, because they're just not intended for the same kind of performance driving. The fact that both of them are 2+2 coupes with a lot of power doesn't really mean very much, because at the end of the day you could name plenty of vehicles with 2 doors, 4 seats and a similar amount of power. That does not mean that they are direct rivals. Consider, for instance, I could name a vehicle that has 2 doors, 4 seats and 550 horsepower. What car am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the Cadillac CTS-V Coupe. Now I'm talking about a car with 2 doors, 4 seats and around 550 horsepower. Am I talking about the Cadillac again? No, now I'm talking about the Lister Storm. Not exactly a direct rival, despite the fact that both of them have essentially the same spec sheet. Likewise here, just because it seems like an M3 rival doesn't mean that it is one. Mercedes models have those low-down, grunty V8 engines. This doesn't have quite as much torque as a Mercedes, but it's certainly pretty torquey, 391 pound-feet. That's a lot more than something like an E92 M3, for instance, which had less than 300 pound-feet, and the weight is high. Once again, just like a Mercedes. But I would argue that the similarity does not end there, because the funny thing about Mercedes AMG models, the coupes in particular, like the C-Class, the CLK, is that they're not actually good handling cars. That's the funny thing about them. You could trick yourself into thinking that they are, but they're really not. The M3 is a good handling car. Mercedes, I would argue, again doesn't necessarily try to be. They're essentially the German equivalent of a muscle car. Huge torque, massive capacity, rear-wheel drive, tyre shredding fun. Like a Dodge Challenger, or a Camaro, or a Mustang. Much similar to those than they are to M3s. And I would say the same about this one. I would say that you should put this car up against Mercedes AMGs, muscle cars and Cadillacs, not BMW M3s and Porsches. And as long as you remember that, I think you'll actually find the car to be a lot better. Now, I covered on some of the specs. You're looking at the 5-litre V8 engine, 8-speed gearbox, just under 470 horsepower, just under 400 pound-feet of torque. It is very heavy. 1,790 kilos is a huge curb weight. That's well beyond an SLR McLaren, almost as heavy as a Veyron. And when you say it that way, it doesn't sound too great. But again, it's a road car. This is not a track day special. It doesn't need to be the lightest thing around. The problem comes when you put it in a game which is about circuit racing. And of course, that is a valid argument. So what can it do around a track? Well, as you can see here at Bathurst, it's not going to be the fastest thing around. I've actually tuned mine. I've dropped the weight considerably to closer to 1,300 kilos if memory serves, and I've also crucially reduced the power, because that is what I would say is the most important thing. Well, let's say the second most important thing to dropping the weight on this vehicle, because can it cope with more power? Yes. Should it? Not necessarily. I believe that the RCF should have less power, because the less power you have in a car like this, you can sometimes see the true ability of a car shine through when it's not clouded by all of that wheel spin and torque and noise. That is where you can cut through the noise to see how good the character itself of the car is. And to me, when I detuned this one very slightly really from N500 to N400, the results spoke for themselves. It wasn't that far off the kind of performance that I was getting in my Porsche GT3. That's impressive. Here at Bathurst, it's not the easiest of tracks for a car which is bigger and heavier. There are some very tight corners, it requires high-speed flow, and yet it did well. So to me, the RCF is actually a very, not unsung, but it's a very misunderstood car, you could say. It's a car that even I myself am not a huge fan of because of what it does, but funnily enough, I'm not actually a fan of those Mercedes AMG coupes either, even though I am a Mercedes fan overall. In terms of pricing, unfortunately, and it is very unfortunate, it falls just short of Blue Moon Bay. It's 95,000 credits, and that is a shame, because I think this car would be very good for that. But in terms of circuit racing, it definitely has its place. N400, you could try N500 if you want to, but as I've said about a number of cars, you need to be careful, because anything above N400, you're really starting to get into OP territory with stuff like supercars, Porsches, so I would encourage you to try to keep it to N400. I'm not sure if you can detune this one to N300, you might be able to. If you can, you should certainly give that a try. But overall, it's a car that has a lot of merit. You just have to know when to use it, not only how to use it, because a lot of cars are universal. Some of them, though, are more niched, they're more specialist. They are very good at specific tracks and very bad at other ones. For example, the classic Mini absolutely destroys on the Nürburgring because it's so fast through the corners. You take that same Mini around Le Mans and it can barely beat anything. So know your car, know what it's good for, and use it for that. For me, I would say that the RCF is worth looking at. Most people probably won't use it all the time, but at the very least, it is worth a look. But that's it for my thoughts overall. Of course, stick around here on the channel for more reviews, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.